What are the difficulties of getting permanent residency in Sweden? Permanent residence means you have a right to live and work freely in Sweden during the stated period. It also means that you are entitled to, for example, student loans and grants from CSN. The expulsions happen when a worker is applying for an extension to their work permit. Generally, new workers will get a 2-year visa, which is renewed for another 2 years, after which the worker can apply for permanent residence. Very often it is only after 2 or 4 years that mistakes in the application or permit obligations are noticed, by which time it can be too late to fix. The mistakes often involve insurance, but can also be cases where someone was accidentally paid below the minimum wage for their sector or did not take enough holiday. Sweden has a serious labor problem. A lack of qualified talent is hampering employers and obstructing growth, especially in sectors such as tech that require skilled labor. And yet, many high-skilled migrants are seeing their work permit extensions rejected on the basis of small administrative errors made during their residency. A law passed in Sweden that would forgive small errors such as ollies. Sweden's Justice and Migration Minister Morgan Johansson said, as quoted in the local, "If it's a small unintentional mistake, there has to be the possibility to fix the error." Diversify campaigns for people affected by kompetensutvisning. This week the foundation released the preliminary results from a survey of labor migrants whose permit extensions have been rejected. Though official numbers on kompetensutvisningar are hard to come by, the Swedish Migration Agency said 85% of applicants for a work permit extension in 2018 received a positive decision, but could not confirm the number of applications. This kompetensutvisning baseline includes 571 people who were at some stage of the process with the migration agency. Of these, 29% reported having their application denied due to an error by their employer, and a further 58% were still waiting on a decision. Diversify's survey also looked at the mental health effects of this process. Over 75% reported adverse mental health effects related to the fear of rejection, an inability to access state services such as childcare, and the inability to leave Sweden during the application process. 69% of the people surveyed said they would not recommend another foreigner come to Sweden for work, citing unclear rules and extended waiting times. Previously, you could apply for a permanent residence permit as soon as you had been resident for 4 years with a permit that qualifies as the basis of a permanent residence permit, regardless of the expiry date on your current residence permit. In April 2019, the Swedish Migration Board issued a new interpretation of the regulations and now states that applications may only be submitted no more than 14 days before the current residence permit expires. Several people who had applied earlier have had their applications rejected and must instead submit a new application 14 days before their current permit expires. This will lead to problems, as anyone who leaves Sweden during the gap between 2 residence permits will not be allowed to re-enter the country. This makes it difficult for people to attend conferences or to take other trips abroad. This is how they currently apply the rule. Please note that you are still entitled to stay and work in Sweden during the waiting period. If you are a citizen of a non-EU country and have lived in Sweden without interruption for 5 years, you may be granted long-term resident status. This is not the same thing as a permanent residence permit in Sweden. This means you have greater opportunities to work, study, or start your own business in most other EU countries. To be granted long-term residence status in Sweden, you have lived in Sweden for at least 5 years without interruption, time spent outside Sweden, shorter than 6 months continuously and not more than 10 months in total during the 5-year period, shall not be counted as an interruption. Have been granted residence permits for the last 5 years. Residence permits for visits and studies other than doctoral studies may not be included. Be able to support yourself and your family. The maintenance requirement is not valid when applying for permanent residence permit or citizenship, but is valid when applying for long-term residence status. If you have a permanent residence, you can stay outside Sweden, but within the EU in the countries covered by the agreement, for up to 6 years. Applying for long-term residence status in Sweden may be an option if you have lived in Sweden for 5 years, but for some reason do not meet the requirements for permanent residence or citizenship. If you had a residence permit based on family membership, this time may be counted, as well as a residence permit for doctoral studies. If you are granted status as a long-term resident, you will also be granted a permanent residence permit.